John, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Well done, Kris.
Okay then. So everyone else is on mute, which is good for the session. So just very briefly, this is the workshop on risk assessment processes, and you've got two short presentations for opportunity to ask questions. I'm Kris Jones. I'm from Nottinghamshire County Council. My colleague is John O'Connor from Lincolnshire County Council. We're neighbours in that sense in the East Midlands. I'm going to just put up the presentation that we'll be both using. So just bear with me for a few seconds while I find it. Okay, so hopefully I can see it and I can see John, which suggests that everyone else will be able to see the presentation. So that's who we are and our job titles. What we're inviting people to do is to obviously, and you've been in a workshop prior to this one, so you know, we're not going to do introductions this afternoon, but we invite you to put your name, which is already there, but also add your job title and where you're from. And as you'll be aware, these sessions are being recorded. So if you don't want to be in the recording, then turn off the camera and use chat for asking questions. Anna has joined us from CDC to take some notes and to help capture questions that we'll come to later on. So as it says there, I'm to go first, then John, and then we'll open up to chat questions. So our presentations aren't the same, but there are a few slides. There's a few slides each. So what I want to talk about is Nottinghamshire, what we've been doing in Nottinghamshire over the last 2 months. And in that sense, we came to our processes around risk assessments later than probably Lincoln, well, certainly later than Lincolnshire, and but we followed very much the national guidance as it was issued. What we've also linked our risk assessment process to is the temporary changes in centre legislation that came through. So I'm going to go through that first column under risk assessment guidance. So what we've asked schools to do is to provide us summaries of the risk assessments that they've completed, and it says schools, it's all settings from early years through to specialist colleges and post-16 provision. We've asked them to provide summaries, so that's names, but also details of whether they're attending, whether they're being able to access online learning, how often and how they keep in touch with the individual child, and Nottinghamshire's definition of vulnerable children and young person includes those open to social care, those with obviously VHCPs, but also those that receive what we call in Nottinghamshire high level funding, which is another cohort of students. We've also invited, and obviously the description of vulnerability has changed since the original guidance to include groups like young carers. So we're asking schools to provide summaries of their risk assessments. We're asking them to RAG rate, and the RAG rating is focused on attendance and the risk to the child of not attending. And we're also asking schools then to provide further details of those that they RAG rate red. So those details, for those that are rated as red, those details are then passed by the local authority. They come into a central team and they are then passed on to the appropriate support worker. And we do that largely through our client database Mosaic. So we we use the alert mechanism on that. So for instance, if the child or young person is a social worker, we would alert their child social worker at the school. Now, you know, things change quite quickly, don't they, in a child's life? So, you know, our social workers have also been contacting their children open to them, but things change, and a different perspective might always be helpful. Where there's health issues raised, we would raise them directly with a provider. We've agreed that with our providers in Nottinghamshire, and where resolution is not available through that contact, we can then escalate it for our designated clinical officer to the commissioners. I've got to sort of say, as far as risk assessments, and I move on to the structured conversations around temporary changes to SEND legislation, we've had no need to make any escalations at the moment. We've had a few. I mean, it's not that parents are completely happy, but we've had a few sort of parents who've raised it as an issue, but you know, there's been no need to escalate it at this stage. Temporary changes to SEND legislation. So alongside the risk assessment, so we're asking schools to complete the risk assessments. We've provided examples, but we're very much letting them decide how they want to undertake their risk assessments. We've reminded them of the guidance. We reminded them that they need to involve parents and as the guidance says, young people as well in those risk assessments. But we're also, as part of the changes to SEND legislation, we're undertaking structured conversations with parents, carers and young people. Very much focused on section 42, the provision plans, again, RAG rating responses and following up those issues raised with settings. And likewise, we'll also follow up on health issues in terms of provision not being delivered as outlined in the EHCP plan. So moving on, this is my second and last slide. So this is just a few of the numbers, some of the issues that have been raised by families and young people, and lessons that we're going to take forward. Risk assessments, nearly 5,000 summaries returned. Of those that have been RAG rated and have an EHC plan, there's been 116. With our structured conversations, which is a process that's still ongoing, we've started off with early years and mainstream settings, and we've by and large completed those. Of the 2,100 completed, 84 or 4% being RAG rated red. So that's where families are not satisfied with the provision that they've been provided with. Okay, so some of the issues, and the focus of structured conversations isn't just on provision, it's almost a welfare check. So we're asking families, and where appropriately we talk to the young people, we're asking them how they're feeling, what it's been like during COVID-19, what they've been up to, both in terms of online learning, but also other opportunities they've had during this period, if that's been possible.
Bernie
and
is now joining.
So I just list five issues raised. So probably the key one is anxiety around the return to school or college, and that can be both the parent carer, but obviously the young person, child or young person, and their levels of anxiety. Possibly linked to that, a number of families are reporting the challenge of behaviour on the family, and families describe that as a process. In some families, it's been bad at the beginning, it's got better. In other families, it was okay initially, but it's now becoming much more challenging. The lack of communications from settings, the lack of differentiation in the work set by settings, and inevitably issues that existed back in February, March are still there in many parents and carers' minds. So those are the issues, and they're the issues amongst those that have been RAG rated red. And some cases it's more than one issue. Okay, so for the service as a whole, and I think we shared this right across SEND services in Nottinghamshire, is very much the positive response from families. Families have welcomed us contacting them in the structured conversations and talking to them and spending time. It's led to a greater focus on the child young person in our practice, and that's being supported by improved partnership working, where we're meeting partners on a regular. It started off daily, it's now twice, 3 times a week, where we're getting together to discuss and share those families that we have the greatest concerns about. So in addition to getting feedback from schools and structured conversations, we're also sharing information we've got about families, those families that we're in contact with, sometimes on a daily basis with colleagues in children's social care. Greater use of technology and how that could be used in future. Better levels of engagement through greater use of technology, through different use of technology. And finally, probably the most important one, which sums up the previous 4, is the impact on how we will deliver services in the future. I think it's shifted us from focusing on processes to focusing on the child and family, and I think that will benefit everyone concerned going forward, and we'll implement that structurally in the autumn. Sorry, John, it just froze on me for a moment.
That is okay. Thank you very much, Kris. Thanks for those that have posted questions already. What we wanted to do was to be able to do both sessions and then use as much of the time at the end for questions as possible. So keep them coming through. We will go back and answer as many of those as we can. If we can't answer them in the individual session, then we give a commitment to answer them at the end and get them circulated separately. So thanks very much, Kris. And just to give you context for Lincolnshire, because sometimes the size is important to understand what we're trying to set our context with. So we've got currently about 5,500 EHCPs, 356 schools in total. That serves a pupil population of about 106,000 students. Thank you, Kris. So in the beginning, I know it might seem like a very long distant past now, but when lockdown was first initiated in sort of towards the middle to late of March, we were very conscious that our schools were going to be in a situation of almost utter chaos in terms of attempting to meet the initial demands of what did lockdown mean for them. So us contacting them, we didn't think was going to be in their interest at all. So we took a different tact, and we decided to take all of our SEND caseworkers offline for a 2-week period to do nothing other than to make contact with all of the families to establish where the children were their needs being met, did they have any worries about the arrangements, and to reiterate to them 2 things really. The first thing is that the person calling is their SEND caseworker, so don't forget that's your named contact within the local authority who you can make contact with. In the first instance though, we would always encourage parents to talk with schools around their individual needs, because schools are generally more agile to respond to those, but should that not be the case, then they can come to us. We were fortunate, or we are still fortunate, that we have one children's database, which is very much like Nottinghamshire, in that we use Mosaic as well to hold all of our case level information on children. So anything that is about recording detail on children is all in one place, so we can read across into our social care teams as to what they're holding, and they can read across into ours as well. It's all based on that same child. Using what we know, what we spoke to the parents about, and any other information that we might know from the case file, we would end up with an assessment of overall risk. This risk really is around being able to say, do we believe they are best served at home, i.e. for safety, or best served at school to meet their needs and safety? In the end, of all of those 5,500 phone calls, there was only 10 that we needed to follow up with. Well, just less than 10 actually. I think the number was 9. And of those, we had a conversation with the setting, talked through what our concerns were, talked through all what the parents had spoken to us about their concerns. And in all of those cases, they were all integrated back into school. It was a relatively straightforward process. What was quite nice to hear was that families really didn't think we would call them. They thought we were just an amorphous face in a big ivory tower, not really interested. But one of the things that was really quite positive was that somebody was phoning them, asking them how they were and what their arrangements were, and were they safe and content. Now, at that time, schools had been completing the DfE daily survey, and out of that, you can pull out a list of vulnerable children, as the definition was at that time. And we got 15% of our vulnerable children that were in school within those first initial 2 weeks. So we were doing quite well, but no degree of complacency setting in there. We asked all schools to risk assess all children that were at home and not in school. And that was a very clear expectation from lockdown first starting. Obviously, the risk assessment guidance evolved quite quickly out of government, but schools were already well onto that. And we'd also introduced this concept that not only are you doing a risk assessment, it's not a static risk assessment, it needs to be dynamic and responding to needs of children, which means you're going to need to have regular contact with your all of your children that are not in school, but some of those children you will want to contact more frequently than others. And we set this expectation that those phone calls or contacts with parents would be, for some children, it could be a couple of times a week. For some, it would be once a week. And for the majority, it would be a contact within 2 weeks. Not saying that those were the absolute timeframes, but that was our expectation. And schools largely have complied with that and been updating any risk assessments as they went along. We did say to them, though, that because we'd undertaken this piece of work to work with parents to establish the arrangements for children, if the school changed those arrangements, or the school and the parent between them changed those arrangements, we would need to know. And the onus was on the school to let us know, not the parent. It was the school to let us know about changes in circumstances. That would mean our ongoing snapshot should be able to be kept up to date for the majority of children. Obviously, as the whole situation has evolved, guidance out from government has changed. So what was then being introduced was that selected year groups within schools would be introduced, largely within the early years nursery primary sector, in that the nursery reception year 1, year 6 were going to be reintroduced. And as of last week, we've had to undertake additional work to update our risk assessment that we hold centrally on children. So what we decided was, we know the vast majority of our children that have got an EHCP will not fall into a high risk category. There'll be a lot of children whose situation by being at home would be appropriate for their safety. And then there are children who we will have a difference of opinion on, and those are the ones that we want to try and target through our ongoing arrangements. So we decided whatever approach we would take, therefore, would have to be proportionate to the risks that we knew of. We also decided we would not ask parent, carers or schools any information that we weren't prepared to act on, because it's pointless asking for information that isn't going to help anybody make decisions. You okay for the next slide, Kris? At that point in time, this is last week, when we were undertaking a pupil survey at primary schools, our DfE survey was saying that of our vulnerable children, 42% of them now were in a school setting. The problem was, though, we don't know which of those 42% children are actually in school. So we decided to do a, hopefully, proportionate risk survey for schools, which we're doing it in batches, to say to them that we need to, first of all, understand which of the children in school. That will allow us then to update our risk assessment further. So to try to minimise the amount of work that we're asking schools to do, we pre-populated files for all of our schools, listing all of their children that have got an EHCP. And the first question is the child in school? And they're all set to default yes, because that should be the preferred arrangement for all children. If that is the case, there is nothing further for them to do. If the child is not in school, then there are 4 additional questions, and they're all yes, no's. So the first one we'll be asking them is the child still on roll? That's just to confirm we're not out of sync by the time we take the files out of the system. Has the school offered a place, but it's parental preference that they remain at home? That will help us with our risk assessment. And is the school maintaining a risk assessment on the child? That auto defaults to yes, because they should. And is the child currently not attending due to illness? And again, that would help, particularly on some of our children that have got medical needs. It would be interesting for us to know that they're not at school because of a medical reason. That then would give us the bare bones of information for us to be able to make a reasonable attempt at updating our risk assessment. And out of the consequence of this, it will lead to, again, targeted phone calls with settings. We've originally done it with primary schools because as of last week, that would have been the 3rd week that they will have had these phased transitional returns for year groups in. So it should be relatively stable in terms of numbers. We're currently doing our special schools pupil referral unit and alternative provision this week. And then next week, we're looking to do our secondary schools. FE colleagues and early years, we're using a different approach for, because in early years, the volume is massive. So we need to have something that is very different. And with our FE colleagues or post-16, because we've got a different arrangement with them over funding of those placements, then we're able to do that through a different route. And we've undertaken that already, and that's something we haven't had to go to them for additional information for that. The overall response so far from schools has been they've appreciated the ability, and they can see the ability that we've tried to ask them minimal information to achieve maximal impact about risk. But as I think most people will be aware, everybody is wanting to know the answer to lots of things, of which we don't always have those answers. And I'm very mindful that, trying to understand what is in a child's individual EHCP and what is actually being delivered at the very minutiae is not a practical reality for us. It can only ever be on a very broad brush approach around, do they have access to services that they need? And of those that don't, then obviously we talk, as Kris has mentioned, with the appropriate commissioning client. So I hope that gives us sort of overview. We did want to be able to make a reasonable chunk of time, which is broadly the same amount of time that we had in the last session. So we've got just over a quarter of an hour in which to go through and answer questions. So feel free to keep adding them to the chat function. I'm just going to whiz back and see what we've had. Right, so there's one from Zara Bowden, which is, are you picking up when children, young people and parent carers are not involved in the risk assessment in discussions, and have you tackled when they are not fully engaged? So do you want to kick off, Kris?
Yeah, I mean, we've had this query from our own parent carer forum, Zara, and it's good to see you again as well. We've tried to emphasise in our guidance that risk assessments are supposed to be completed involving the parent carer and also the young person. And certainly when we've had the structured conversations, some of those disagreements that parents and carers have had with schools, we've then followed up directly. And often some of them are about the assessment of where the school feels the child is. But I think it's often about what they're receiving and the communications from schools rather than, the risk assessment. So that may be because they may not know about the risk assessment, but, we do follow it up and we do challenge. But in our general communication with schools, we emphasise the need to involve parents and carers in those risk assessments.
From a Lincolnshire point of view, I think what we've recognised is we can't always ask schools and always ask parents and carers and always ask children, young people at every time we're updating the risk assessment. Only just practicality of attempting to do that. The hindsight way of realising that we may have achieved components of this is we started off by making contact with the families. So we started with their input into what this journey was. We hoped to give them reassurance that they have us as contacts they can come to, but anything that they were on a day-to-day concern, they would go through with the school. We have and we are now taking the school's involvement in that, but we've also expressed to schools that they can't just be maintaining a risk assessment that is a piece of paper living in a drawer. It has to be a dynamic risk assessment that is being updated, and therefore we expect and have said to them, you will be making regular contact with all parents, not just those with an EHCP. You may well be phoning them slightly more frequently to get the views of parents, not to tell them what you think your risk assessment says, but to invite them for comments, because for some of our families, their needs have changed over time, and that their desire to have the children in school now is greater than it was previously because of just the impact on the family. So a very practical situations, which if schools aren't making contact with them, they wouldn't pick up. So I would say it's not perfect, but
if you're sorry to just jump in on the mic, is that picking up the year 6 reception, year 1 cohorts of SEN pupils as well then, if they're contacting everybody who's eligible to come back into school? So are you picking up the SEN support areas where children and families might be struggling a little bit? Are you then doing anything with that information if that's been identified to you, or are you just expecting schools to put in place their usual SEN support packages?
Just to help me with that question, because there are 2 potential answers. Do you mean of those children that are in school now, are they still maintaining that risk assessment with parents at home? So the children are in school?
No, I mean any child that is eligible to go back into school, if they're having those conversations around the risk assessment to return, are they picking up anything with SEN students rather than EHCP students, and how are you responding to that as a local authority if that's brought to your attention, or are you just expecting schools to continue to put the wraparound support in at the SEN support level as normal?
So in terms of those with SEN support, yes, we expect schools to maintain a risk assessment on all children that are not at school, irrespective of their types, and that would include for SEN support too. In terms of those children that are, say, returning to school with SEN support, some of them are going to struggle to get additional services outside the school to come in, because that is not current recommended practice for external agencies to be in school. However, external agencies are finding ways to engage with schools over things that don't require a visit. So quite a lot of specialist teacher work is now being done over either things like MS Teams or Zooms with teachers at school and with the child themselves. So where it could be catered for a normal SEN wraparound provision within the school, yes, we would expect them to do that. Just to move on, the one that came in after that was, I think this one might be more specific to you, Kris, because it involves about the structured conversation. And it was, how are you responding to those structured conversations with a red outcome?
Okay, so I mean, what we're doing there is where it's appropriate, and say where it's appropriate was not in every one. And again, not in every one does the parent want us to do this, but we will actually approach the setting. And I've only done a few structured conversations, and I know that I approached it as a green structured conversation outcome. The young person has actually done very well because of their particular needs, been quite well met through online and regular tutorial sessions through Microsoft Teams. But there are a couple of issues about returning to college in September, and the college responded within a matter of days to those issues. So we are being as proactive as we can be. We're trying to take parents with us, so some parents will tell us about their concerns but ask us not to. But I think there's a point that John made earlier, is that this opens up an avenue for the parents to come back to us if they want us to take further action at a later stage. Quite clearly, what we're doing. There's a further question later on. We do share these issues with other colleagues within the local authority and with health colleagues. The general themes that I mentioned, we've shared, we've discussed, and we've looked at seeing how we can, as a group of services, support families through this. So issues of anxiety, we've done a lot of work for our EPS service about preparing materials for schools. We're looking now at doing a webinar for parents and carers in Nottinghamshire about issues they may be facing about returning to school. So we try to pick those up as a partnership and looking at, rather than, as a, obviously responding to the individual, but also responding to those collective issues.
Can I just ask a further question on that?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I know obviously we mustn't have blanket policies, far from it. But I was just wondering if in those conversations, because of, for us, or a concern is this agreement on what is reasonable. So I'm thinking that in a red conversation, you might have parents who feel that the provision that is being offered is not reasonable. And yet in your conversations with schools, perhaps you're not able to negotiate. Are you finding a sort of a common agreement on what you feel sits comfortable is that you have exercised reasonable endeavours?
Yes. I mean, I think, look, when we look back with hindsight, we may think that, we could have done things better. But I think generally we're approaching settings they've been understanding. I think parents, what we're trying to do is trying to bring them together in meetings where that's appropriate as well, and where parents want to have that sort of forum to discuss directly, but to have our services really supporting that process. So I don't think we've had anything where we've had a significant fallout. I mean, like I said, there are some existing issues. So I think all of us working in this area will know that there are some things that, because there's various circumstances, are incredibly difficult to resolve. So those issues remain. But I think the issues that have been raised through this structured conversation, I think we feel confident that we've been able to respond and we've been able to mediate with schools, a response that parents and carers have felt, is a reasonable outcome, to use the government jargon.
Hi.
Does that help, Laura?
It's Anna just cutting in. We have about 5 or 6 more minutes. There's some themes coming through on questions, certainly about which staff are undertaking the structured conversations, about business as usual and capacity. And then another one I wanted to pick up on, another theme about schools asking for extra evidence or demanding GP letters or clinic letters, etc. Perhaps if you could kind of group those together, that would be really helpful. Okay.
Shall I just go through some of those?
Thank you.
In terms of Nottinghamshire, we did think initially to use all our SEND services to do structured conversations, but the managers of the assessment service, which is quite a large service and covers other teams rather than just the EHCP assessments, decided they would take on that piece of work. That's probably delayed it slightly, but I think the benefits are there. So you're talking of, and when I say 40 staff, that would be the maximum number. Some of those staff are not full time, so it's roughly about 40 staff that have been involved. So far, we've managed to maintain business as usual. We've got staff themselves who are shielding. We've got staff with obviously childcare responsibilities that many families are facing at the moment, and so forth. But we've managed to maintain business as usual. In terms of our processes around the EHCP, we're maintaining timescales. We've had a big project over the last 6 months to reduce our backlog of annual reviews, and we've almost done that. We're down to the final few. And again, some of the practice that we've developed as part of COVID-19 through Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams, we've managed to complete reviews. One of the first things we noticed from schools was the return of paperwork was a lot quicker as a result. So there's been some positives around that as well. I think we've met all our timescales in terms of plans, bar one in each of the 2 previous months. It might get tighter over the summer months. I mean, we'll wait and see. But so far, we've managed to maintain things. Do you want to say something, John?
In terms of the business as usual for Lincolnshire, it's hard to imagine what that was actually. But we had a backlog before we went into COVID of annual reviews. And talk about clouds giving silver linings. We've had about 20 of our specialist teachers team we've been able to redeploy to help us on our annual reviews. So we're actually starting to get back into timescales for the majority of these, and we hope that by sort of mid-July, sort of like towards the end of July, we will have met that backlog, which we wouldn't have anticipated being able to do in a non-COVID world. Parents have been very supportive of our efforts to attempt to complete annual reviews via other alternative methods. And in terms of best endeavours and conversations with schools, like Kris has said, we either had to be the mediator, or we've tried to see if we can meet common ground over where expectations of meeting the need when they're returning to school. It's not perfect and it's not ideal, but it is what do we think is reasonable. And again, in the handful of cases where we have had to mediate, we have been able to meet common ground. I don't know how that will be as we move forward, because pressures on families are increasing all the time. But to date, we have been able to sit in that middle ground and mediate between parents and schools.
On the question about people asking for medical evidence, I'm not aware of, in terms of all the structured conversations, that has been an issue in Nottinghamshire. I'm not saying it isn't an issue, but it's not been raised. I presume there's guidance which came out at the end of last week.
Yeah.
And Andre referred to it in his presentation earlier this afternoon, where the government is saying is that schools should not be asking or requiring that evidence prior to a child or young person returning to their setting. So we're going to communicate that with schools in the way that we've been communicating throughout this period. So there'll be a very clear message, and I'm in the process of writing that today, so that will go out later on this week. So, and likewise with those young people that have been shielding to date, there's a change there in the sense that if parents and carers wish their children to return, the fact that they've been shielding isn't a reason for them not to return. I think there's still room in that guidance for schools to interpret it in the sense that that is one of the those issues shouldn't prevent a child returning, so not having medical evidence and the child previously being shielding. But there may be other things that schools may raise, such as accommodation, space, etc. But but at least it closes that request that some schools
is now exiting.
Making. John, I don't know if you've had experiences in Lincolnshire.
Not of certainly not as harsh as letters from solicitors demanding GP assessments. That's really quite extreme, and it is shamefully not understanding the situation. Really, we've not had that. We have had a couple of cases where some schools have not felt they could meet personal hygiene care of some of their children safely, and we've been able to have conversations with them through using our public health team within the local authority, because that's where it is based, in terms of being able to talk them through what that looks like practically. So I think what they've done is they've raised issues with us, and then we've been able to respond with the school to help them therefore feel that they can meet the families, or they can meet the child's needs in school. But very, very few, I must say.
Yeah. I've been asked at the beginning, and through the chat, you've received a link to the evaluation for today's event. So we're all encouraged to fill that in. So it's in the chat box, and it came in at 24 minutes past 4. And it says it'll only take a few minutes to complete. So if you got a chance, please do that.
So it comes to me, I think, to say thank you very, very much for Kris and John for doing the 2 workshops. Loads of very, very rich conversations. There will be a sharing of all the slides. There will be some Q&As shared, and then there will be a case study written up for wider sharing from CDC to partners that weren't here today and further afield. And thank you very much for everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, John.